Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you who are joining us from different parts of the world, different time zones around the world. My name is Kathy Teo. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm speaking to you from Singapore, where I am based. I'm very proud to be representing Outright Action International in the capacity of board director, to be welcoming you to Out Summit 2021. This is one of the sessions of the summit's corporate purpose and LGBTIQ human rights track. And this session is hosted by Outright and the Partnership for Global LGBTI Equality, or PGLE. Before we commence, just a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, this webinar is recorded, but only our speakers are on screen. There will be a Q&A at the end, so do place your questions in the Q&A function. Our Outright staff will also be using the chat function to share important information throughout the program and important resources, so do look out for that. We invite you to introduce yourself using the chat function, including your name, preferred pronouns, where you're joining us from, and your institutional affiliation. I'd like to quickly introduce our co-hosts for today's session. First off, Outright, founded in 1990 and with consultative status at the United Nations, Outright works at a global, local, and regional level to eradicate the persecution, inequality, and violence that lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, and queer people face around the world. Our second host is Partnership for Global LGBTI Equality, or PGLE. PGLE is an initiative of BSR, the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the World Economic Forum. And it is a coalition of organizations that are committed to leveraging individual and collective advocacy to accelerate LGBTI equality and inclusion globally to drive positive change. On behalf of Outright and PGLE, a very warm welcome to one and all who are here with us today. In this session, we will explore the advocate model, specifically how the corporate sector can advance LGBTI inclusion when it conflicts with local law and culture. I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists for today in alphabetical order. First of all, Ulfert de Wit. Ulfert is Chief Operating Officer of HSBC Continental Europe at HSBC Corp. Ulfert was most recently Chief Operating Officer at HSBC Singapore, and for a moment also held the role of interim CEO during a management transition. So he comes with very interesting perspectives, having lived and worked in Europe and in Asia. Our second panelist, Weena Ikid, is Vice President of JP Morgan Chase and Chairperson of the Philippines Financial and Inter-Industry Pride, or PFIP. Weena was also on our Out Summit Asia corporate panel last year, and we're really glad to have him back on our panel again today. And our third panelist is Claire Erie. Claire is Associate General Counsel and Senior Director at Procter & Gamble. She's responsible for ensuring strong governance and compliance practices globally. I have to say how excited I am, Claire, about having you on this panel. Corporate LGBTI advocacy in many countries is often hampered by concerns that the legal, compliance, governance, or government affairs folks have. So I can't wait to hear your take on how P&G actively advocates for social justice in all the markets that you operate in. Lastly, we were meant to be joined by Keshav Suri, who's the Executive Director of the Lalit Suri Hospitality Group and also founder of the Keshav Suri Foundation, but Keshav unfortunately had to cancel due to unforeseen circumstances. So we will definitely be missing Keshav on this panel, but it means that we will have more time to hear from our other wonderful panelists. Weena, Ulfert, Claire, I'm very glad to have you on the panel today. Very excited about the dialogue that we're going to have. So let's go ahead and get started. It's been 2 years since the world first heard of the coronavirus, or COVID-19, and the global health pandemic is still ongoing. So with this, there has been a renewed focus on inequality that has called into question the very foundation upon which society collectively seeks to tackle global problems. This includes respecting human rights, including the rights of LGBTIQ people, with stakes that are so high, no country, company, or community can expect to solve the problem by themselves. So the need for collective action has never been greater, and companies have an important role to play alongside other actors, especially when the state or the states fall short. So when we say states, we don't mean the United States, we mean governments around the world in general. So building on the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights, the UN Human Rights Office has developed 5 standards of conduct to support the business community in tackling discrimination against LGBTIQ people. The 5 standards are specifically respect human rights, eliminate discrimination, provide support, prevent other human rights violations, and last but not least, to act in the public sphere. These standards offer a strong foundation for business action on LGBTIQ inclusion in every country and region. But as we know, with uneven legal frameworks and protections that exist across various jurisdictions on a global basis, in many countries, it is challenging for companies to align with practices, to align their business practices with their business values. Hence, multinational corporations and anti-LGBTIQ jurisdictions tend to choose among 3 models of engagement. One, when the first model is when in Rome, where they adhere to the norms of the jurisdiction by creating exceptions to their pro-LGBT plus policies. 2, the embassy model, where they apply pro-LGBT plus policies and practices only to their own employees. And the third is the advocate model, where they strive to make change externally, such as lobbying the government or supporting local activists. So the first question, and I'd like to direct this to Weena and Claire, using concrete examples for Asia, and both JP Morgan and P&G and indeed HSBC have extensive business operations across all of Asia, using concrete examples for Asia and noting that our region is not monolithic. What does an application of the advocate model look like in the Asia region? So Claire and Weena, would either one of you like to take that first question? Weena,
Sure.
would you like to go first?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Kathy. This is a very interesting question because, yeah, truth be told, in the region, it's very difficult for businesses to balance the advocacy model at the same time being able to operate their business principles. But well, based on what is current and public information and my personal knowledge of what the advocacy model is, or how the advocacy model is being applied in the region, is organizations having that support agenda on gender-based and cultural aspects of the community that they serve. And I say these 2 aspects because these 2 are the most common that companies take actions in operationalizing their advocacy agenda for Asia. And it's really having an extensive program, say for instance, for women empowerment and support for LGBT and even gender expansive communities. So I think specific examples that corporates do the model is by partnering with organizations or NGOs in the respective countries that they operate. At the same time, business-oriented programs where they make sure that they lobby for social justice, anything that has to do in terms of human rights, without, like I said, sacrificing that business principle that they have. For corporate social responsibility as well, I think this is very easy for corporate to lobby their advocacy for human rights because it has something to do with the communities or the community well-being. While it's also important to note that outlining a program is never enough, companies should always put efforts in truly advocating by showing their voice of support as well, like doing public statements or even signing pledges. I think those are concrete examples that we've seen organizations advocate truly and use their influence to push for the greater goal. Thanks, Kathy. Claire?
Yeah, thanks. I think first, Kathy, I want to touch on the legal aspects, I think, of your original, the question that you had. So being a, international companies, we're always concerned of what if, what are the laws, what can happen? And I think one of the first things that we did at Procter & Gamble when we were developing our strategy globally is, we looked and we used, ILGA has a fantastic map of laws and persecution laws around the globe. And Asia is such a complex and complicated market. You can't apply the same principles to every country, right? We say Asia, but it is not that way. So we wanted to go country by country and really understand the laws of that country, because first and foremost, we want to make sure our employees are safe. We want to make sure we're developing strategies and programs that enable them to be their true authentic selves in a way that keeps them safe. So, we don't want to push an idea from the United States or from Europe that doesn't fit. So that I think first and foremost, it was really important to understand the laws of the country, but then also to meet with our employees and understand their perspective of working in that country. We have a P&G survey each and every year where if people do self-identify, we can really pull from them how they feel. Do they feel that they can be themselves? Do they feel they can speak up? And we use that as a basis, not only personal interviews, but also interacting through our P&G survey to really identify, what is the best approach for us developing, one, employee engagement systems, because we want to help our employees, but then looking at the culture and looking how do we advocate externally. And so that's important. I also think if you don't have a lawyer as part of your affinity team or your employee engagement team, find an ally lawyer, someone who can help you through it, because what you'll hear is legal said we couldn't do it. I don't think that's true. I think you have to start somewhere, and it's hard and it's difficult, but I think you can get over that. And I think from P&G, so P&G is a very large marketing company, and we see the strength that we have is to enable LGBTI people to be seen. We think that we must use our voice to promote equality inclusion. So what we do in markets is that we use the advertising we use to sell our everyday products to show our consumers, our everyday consumers. The hope is that the more times people see themselves and representing themselves, it doesn't matter what the law is, maybe the culture changes, which then enables the law to change. So just to give you some concrete examples, back in 2017, Vicks, so one of our brands for cough and cold, which I think has done really well during the COVID situation. So Vicks had a commercial. We do these "Thank You Mom" commercials sometimes during the Olympics, and it was a Touch of Care campaign. And the ad showed how important a transgender mom was to her adoptive daughter. And that was the first time it had been shown in India. It was a commercial. We launched it without really an understanding of how it would play, and it played exceptionally well. And I actually remember speaking about that commercial at the UN when the first time we were talking about the UN standards. And I think it was just exceptional to see how positive the reaction was. And when companies see positive reaction, they just go off and do more. And I think from there, we've done other campaigns with Ariel is some of our detergents. We've continued on that, and also Lenore has done commercials. And again, it's just showing people, all types of people using our products. And so we try to learn from our employees, learn from local stakeholders, just really what we can do to help drive a better conversation of equality and inclusion. And we typically do that primarily through our ads. That's what you can see. And then we also do conversations behind the scenes. We have a very large government relations team, and having those interactions behind the scenes kind of help enable governments to think a bit differently about how they have looked or have thought about equality and inclusion issues before.
Yeah, no, I love what you just said, Claire, and you shared some really solid tips there. First and foremost, to keep employees safe. Second of all, which I love, find yourself a lawyer ally. I think that's really good advice that we can lean on in every geography. And the third, which was really interesting, when you talk about P&G being a marketing company and leveraging on your strength and your identity as a marketing company to use your marketing expenditure and efforts to create positive experiences, and hopefully being able to create a ripple effect from that. No, that's wonderful. Last year when we had our first ever Asia corporate panel at Out Summit, and we know you were on the panel with me as well. I remember that the conversation centered very much around having robust diversity, equity, and inclusion practices within the workplace as a way that businesses tackle discrimination. So this year, we're actually raising the bar at Out Summit and using the advocate model to focus on how companies can impact positive change, not just within their organizations, but also outside of their organization. My next question, and Olfert, I'm directing it to you. You've run teams and businesses in Europe and in Asia. What do you see as the specific opportunities and challenges in operating consistently in the advocate model across the Asia region?
Thank you, Kathy. Well, let me start with the challenges, although less fun, but I think it's very much, and Claire already referred to this, the legal angle. Yes, you need to have an allied lawyer, but still, the law will determine to an extent what you can do and how consistently you can do it. An international company, and certainly in a regulated industry, will not go against local laws. And that, of course, limits what you can do publicly in certain countries. I think Singapore is a good example. And well, I worked there for the past 3.5 years. Very concrete, we plan to host a public panel discussion on D&I. It was part of the Pink Fest festival, but it would be D&I in the wider sense. We'd arranged everything, great speakers. Unfortunately, the day before we were supposed to hold this, we were told by the police that we needed a permit and that we could not go ahead because in Singapore there is a law that states that international companies and international individuals are not allowed to discuss controversial topics. And we thought, well, if we do D&I in the widest sense, from gender to ability to ethnicity, and yes, also sexuality, it wouldn't be controversial, but we were told differently. So something we could easily do in Hong Kong or in India, in other countries, well, the law limits what you can do. So that is a challenge to consistently doing publicly, living your values publicly. But of course, there is an opportunity because, first of all, internally, you can do a lot. You can also in countries where the law is not so friendly, making sure you create a maximally inclusive workplace, safe spaces, etc. But you can also still have very visible role models. In Singapore, I was very proudly wearing my rainbow colors also into senior meetings with government officials. I think it's important to work with the other international companies. So really working together as international business community, because many countries do see the importance of being competitive in attracting international business and talent. So speaking as the business community is an important opportunity. I do have to say, the business community cannot do this alone, of course. We need NGOs, we need the community to organize as well. And as a business, you can only be a few steps ahead. Otherwise, and that's something we do need to watch out for, you'll get a a new form of colonialism. I mean, the whole reason why some of these countries have these laws is because the Brits imposed what they thought was right at the time. So therefore, I think it's very important to work with local civil society, and well, don't be too scared of, well, if there's negative laws, there's still a lot you can do, and therefore the allied lawyer is important, and work together. I think that's important.
I mean, my question to you was about operating consistently. And while we're asking how businesses can operate consistently, in the example that you gave during your time in Singapore, I think it's an example of where the local state or local government actually acts inconsistently, where on one hand, we have our prime minister who talks about how we welcome LGBTI talent in our country, and we have ministers who are saying there's no discrimination against LGBTI people in Singapore. And on the other, a public panel discussion that HSBC is trying to hold around the generic topic of D&I that wants to include sexual orientation as a point of discussion, suddenly becomes unnecessarily controversial, to the point of the police issuing you a warning and advice. But I mean, that's exactly, and like you said, that's what HSBC Singapore was trying to do is something that would have easily passed the muster in Hong Kong, in India, with no problems whatsoever. And this is the kind of difference in the local landscape that multinational companies actually need to navigate wisely. So, Claire Olford, again, how do companies that are operating in Asia, and HSBC and P&G both have very extensive operations all throughout Asia, how do companies that are operating here, multinational firms, determine their readiness to move along the maturity curve from when in Rome to embassy, from embassy to advocate? How do they determine their readiness to move along this maturity curve?
I'll start off, Kathy. So yeah, so I'll start off. So I think for me, I think what's been helpful is it's hard to tell. I mean, that is like it's a vast unknown of when you're ready. I think that's always the barrier for companies to act, is they feel like they have to be fully ready to do something and fully engaged. But what the PGLE has created, the UN standards, I think it's a roadmap to the advocacy model, because you start with a foundation of respecting human rights. And being a human rights practitioner, I think it's so critical to understand that human rights are for everybody. And that's the foundation. There's not a question that this is the right thing to do. It is the thing to do. You just have to figure out how to get there. So a company first has to recognize and support a respect for human rights across the board. Then you have to ladder up to the next thing, is work on your own operations. You can't go out and advocate if you have operations that are not equal, that are discriminatory. So you need to make sure that you have the right anti-discrimination policies and that you're supporting your employees. And I think what times that you've seen where companies have gone awry is when they just go into the advocacy model. And then people look at their own employees or their own operations and say, are you pinkwashing? Because you're just trying to make money off of something because you really don't have a good sense of what is going on and helping your own operations. So I think it's important, again, look at your operations. Then after you get your operations, the next step in the UN standards is looking at your supply chain, but I think that's also the same time where you're getting outside of your operations and then can go on into advocating. And sometimes don't go into the hardest, start somewhere small and try out pilot programs, because I think what companies need to do, it was a great example with the police with Singapore, companies have to be agile. They have to realize that some things aren't going to work, don't create that as a barrier, learn from it and change and move forward. And I think when you're able to have the right mix of people who understand the ability to be agile, to learn, to listen, that's a key point, to listen, I think then you're ready. Because a lot of times you have like one D&I advocate in the company and you do some campaign and it will backfire because you don't have the right top leadership support. So again, I go back to the having legal involved, having the right leadership involved, so that the company is involved to advocate. It shouldn't be just a brand program. It should be a company foundational advocacy model. But start with your own self, start with your own company, then move out and to advocate, because we just have seen way too many companies that just mess it up for the rest of us by jumping into commercials or jumping into ideas of campaigns that are just wrong, that are just not appropriate. And I think that sends a bad message to the government of course we're doing it the right way. And so I think it's kind of, you have to be thoughtful, you have to be conscientious of, kind of how you move this forward.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for that, Claire. Olfa, did you want to weigh in on that also?
No, I think it does depend on two things that need to align in order to move along the maturity curve. And I will use HSBC in India as an example. First of all, the local environment. We already talked about it. Law is important for international corporates. And of course, India made a huge leap forward in 2018 by getting rid of the Victorian law that criminalizes homosexuality, which Singapore still has. And that was a key catalyst for more activity. But I think secondly, also having the right people internally on the ground to actually drive this topic is crucial, because you can't do this from head office. You need people on the ground who understand local culture. In India, our head of our global service centers, where we have tens of thousands of colleagues working, is a great ally. And when in 2018 the situation changes and you suddenly saw so much more grassroots kind of activities, we have been a clear advocate in the industry for LGBT inclusion, supporting large conferences, working very closely with NGOs. So I think it's those two things that do need to align: local law and civil society, but also having people on the ground who are passionate about it. As a corporate, you then need to make sure that these passionate colleagues have the right corporate support, because it's not just having passionate people. You also need, as a company, give them the support they need. But if you have both, then suddenly you can make major steps forward.
Weena, did you want to chip in on that also?
Actually, just to, I'm hearing both Claire and Olive mention about it. While it's true, and it's very difficult to make sure that both programs internally and externally do come together, but I do see, I mean, as an industry leader, especially for PFIP, these are the things that we don't like to see in organizations. It's more of you joining the advocacy, but then when we check your internal programs, or when asked about your internal programs, it doesn't really exist. So then it becomes more of a lip service for companies who say they advocate for certain things, while when looking at their policies and programs, or even as far as employee service of how inclusive they are, it doesn't necessarily translate. So I think in general sense, regardless of companies, multinationals do have that pitfall of either pinkwashing or just doing lip service and not really truly lensing on what the advocacy really means. And that is going to be more effective if you indeed have internal champions that will carry along the advocacy. You should have LGBT well, future leaders is obviously one great examples of having one. You should have at least have out and proud executives who will have that voice in the table whenever you put on some initiatives. And yeah, I think strong corporate support is very important in understanding the advocacy, more than just being on the bandwagon because, hey, it's June, it's Pride Month, let's all put on our rainbow flags out there. And then come July, everything pauses. So that's not really advocacy for me. So, but yeah, thanks, Kathy.
Yeah, thanks, Veena. That's great. I mean, on the same topic, I mean, what are then some, light touch or deep touch actions that that companies can take with the advocate model? You know, Claire spoke about how the culture of we have to look at the culture and laws on a local basis. We have to look at what the environment of the environment is. When P&G had the Vicks commercial and that Vicks campaign that featured a transgender mom, Claire, that was in 2017, which was before India had repealed their Section 377 and that decriminalized homosexual, and which then decriminalized homosexuality in their country. So, in a sense, sexual orientation and gender identity obviously are separate things. But in a sense, P&G was actually putting out an ad before the environment, so to speak, would have been ready for it. So you kind of wonder whether, what constitutes being an early influencer of how the public perception changes versus, as Veena said, actually jumping on the bandwagon.
Yeah, I think, it's a great thing. It's P&G tends not to wait. I think, laws are important, but sometimes you need large multinational companies to make a stand, create an advertisement that isn't about the law. It's about sharing a story. And again, I think what's critical about that Touch of Care campaign is LGBTIQ people want to be seen. They want their story shared, and that's all we did. We shared a story about a woman who wanted to share her story. I think she was at times maybe felt that she could be in harm's way for sharing that story, but it was so important to share, her journey and her engagement with her adoptive daughter. And we just were there to build that platform for her. And so I think P&G is coming through and sharing stories, sharing individual lives. And if we can share more and more of those stories, I think that can turn the tide. And that can be what changes laws and regulations, because if we wait for legislators, we'd be waiting forever. I think I even go back to just looking at the US and marriage equality. Until you got, more companies signing up and more companies doing the right thing, it could have taken forever for the US Congress to do the right thing or for the Supreme Court. So I think that's what we try to do. Is for us, what's the harm in sharing somebody's story? And if we can share that story and amplify their voice, I think it helps everybody. It may not change the law right away, but we might see more and more people in that country who are able to say, yes, that is the right thing to do. And that's why I felt that was so important, because when we were speaking in Geneva about it, so many people came up and said, thank you. Thank you for that story, because it's about sharing the stories of people and the experiences that they have, but, obviously doing it and trying to do it in a safe way. So, I think sometimes, it's because we're in a unique situation where we do advertise, we're able probably to do a lot more than others. But again, it goes back to, we're not going to advertise and we're not going to share a story unless we feel that we are managing our employees that way. We can't go off with an advertisement about something unless we're protecting our transgender employees, unless we have the right policies in place. And that took time. And now it's our time to go out there. So, maybe it's, maybe we're being a little bit loose and we should follow norms a bit more, but I think that's not been P&G's approach. I would say probably in the last 5 years is to kind of follow the norm. We're trying to change the dialogue.
Thank you for that, Claire. Weena, Olfert, Weena's leaning in. You go, Weena.
Yeah. No, I wanted to touch upon what Claire was saying. I think changing the norm is really something that the businesses would need to recognize they have full potential on. But obviously in the right measures, guided by legal, obviously. But I think it just takes one company for the rest to follow suit. And like what P&G has done, I'm sure a lot of organizations did see the value out of it, and threading carefully, because it may have been something that was widely accepted in the Western countries, in the UK, but in Asia, again, that's another story to tell. Given our diverse backgrounds, we have very strict countries that do not even talk about LGBT at all. Middle East, for instance, something that is very touchy and sensitive about, even speaking about transgender. So it's very, very difficult, but it does really take one company for the rest to follow and see the value out of it. I think collectively, as we come together in the same advocacy, we are a much louder voice. And I think the government itself and even civil society will see that we come in peace. We don't do this for plainly branding. We don't do this to be favored in terms of doing business or operating in those entities, but it's just merely, like what Claire has said, sharing the story, doing the same for our employees, and then for our customers as well.
Yeah, and if I may add, but I do like to see, yes, it takes one company, but it's great to see that whereas your fierce competitors with other companies, this is an aspect where companies can work very closely together. So in Singapore, there is this platform where all the banks get together and share lessons and share, oh, well, we did this, so that isn't possible, where we actually organize stuff together. So it's great to see fierce competitors joining hands to help each other on getting, creating a more inclusive business culture. I think, and there's power in that, in joining up and teaming up. So I just wanted to add that.
No, absolutely. And I think this is what PGLE as an initiative is trying to do, which is to build a coalition of like-minded businesses that want to collaborate to impact positive change on the ground. You know, and while it takes, you know, it's important that businesses and individuals actually act, have the initiative to act individually, but, you know, to have the sensibility to actually form a coalition and an alliance to be able to create even more change, right? Claire spoke about, and again, I love her story about the VIX campaign and leveraging P&G's competency or strength and their marketing capacity to tell stories, and that's how they've been able to impact a lot of change. Olfert, you spoke about business leaders within organizations representing as positive role models, being out and proud, which all of us on this panel have done effectively, and also visibly supporting the movement. What are some, you know, I'm curious about within the finance sector, what are some you know, light touch or deep touch actions or initiatives that you've taken to actually visibly support the LGBTI movement? You know, much like what Claire said about P&G using their marketing platform to actually tell the stories that would otherwise be untold and unheard and unseen. What are some of the actions that the finance industry, I mean, not just within Asia, but around the world have done to actually take on the advocate model. And seeing that Weena, yourself and Olfin are both from the finance sector, and I would mention, just to give you, the panelist that was unable to join us today, Kashaf, in what his organization is doing, the Lalit Suri Hospitality Group in India, they have been, prior to the advocate model being articulated in 2017, prior to India repealing Section 377 in 2018, because they are a queer-led organization, they have been authentically at the core of their business, supportive of LGBTI rights. And their sector in the hospitality and the travel sector as a hotel group has been hit particularly hard by the COVID-19 crisis, as you can imagine, over the last 2 years. And one of the things that they would do conscientiously is not to retrench or furlough LGBTI employees where they can, and actually to use this downtime to upskill and empower and re-enable their employees. And I thought that was something very admirable, particularly from a sector that is very hard hit, the hospitality and travel sector in India and every part of the world. But I'm curious about within the finance sector, what are some of the initiatives that are done to actually support our movement?
It's a good question. I do think it differs quite a bit because, as we said, you need to do something that has impact in the local market. So therefore, in the UK, things we're doing, like having your preferred name on the front of your credit card, even though it might not be your legal name, is kind of a very visible and good example. Whereas in Hong Kong, I think the one thing that has had the most impact, and it's already a number of years ago, is when the iconic lions, the HSBC lions we have in front of our building, when we painted them the rainbow colors. It's only impactful because it's Hong Kong and these lions are part of the city's history, but therefore it has an impact. So it is very dependent on the local situation. I think it all starts with what Claire says, making sure you have internally your policies in order and create the most inclusive environment, and then you tailor to the local situation what you can do and take steps. And therefore, being globally consistent, you probably even shouldn't want to, because it differs for different markets what they think is important. But there are very different things that you can do to be impactful.
Yes, Weena.
Just to add on what Olive had mentioned, well, the financial sector, being in the financial space during the pandemic, right, at least have that leverage or advantage as an industry to support for both their employees and customers. I think from an employee side, internally, the financial sector generally was able to support their employees more in terms of extra help during the pandemic, right? But on the LGBTQ lens, it's fairly difficult because this is where legal stature started to arise. If someone turned positive, if your partner turned positive, there are countries who doesn't really recognize who is your legal partner, who is going to be the one assisting you, etc. So that had become difficult. So I think the financial sector was able to extend assistance in that front. At the same time, those who are also vulnerable. In the Philippines in particular, where we don't have anti-discrimination policies, this is where PFIP, or Philippine Financial Inter-Industry Pride, did see coming together collectively as companies, we could help stride this a bit more. And that's the reason why our name is Philippine Financial first, because it's all the financial sectors we saw in the Philippines who have strong LGBT networks. For some reason, I don't actually know why it's all financial, or it's mostly financial, but I think given our strength, that is where we also saw that we as financial groups is able to provide financial assistance to NGOs or any civil society groups that advocates for LGBT. That way it helps them enable more, especially during the pandemic, right? It was very tough for these organizations to even support, especially for NGOs that are supporting workforce preparedness individuals, transgender employees who's starting to go to the workforce, young LGBT professionals who are leaning towards NGO programs to be ready for the workforce. I think that's where the financial sector was able to help at least.
Thank you for that. The next question I have, and actually I might go to one of the questions that's being asked, which is, have businesses using the advocate model been able to influence other businesses and state entities towards LGBTI inclusion? Yeah, that's a question that's coming from the audience. Would any one of you like to take that question on?
Sure, I can. Yeah, so happy to.
Awesome.
So I do have a good example early on, and this is more of the behind the scenes advocacy model, because not everything will be public to everybody. But at one time we had a supplier. Well, we learned, we got letters that a supplier was not selling our product to LGBTI companies. And they were sending letters saying it's not their beliefs, they're not going to do it. And, you know, we found, I mean, that was inappropriate. We sell our products to everybody. And so what we did with that model, because what they were doing was discriminatory, we reached out to that company and we told them if they wanted to sell P&G product, they must sell to all of our consumers, and they cannot disrespect and be discriminatory against our suppliers. And, you know, at first they try to make the, you know, statement about religion or whatever they're trying to make. But at the end of the day, if you want our products, you are going to sell to our consumers. And so what they did is we got them to update their policies to make an anti-discrimination statement. They apologized to each and every company that they said they would not sell to. And this was just to keep our business. And I think, you know, in your mind, I think, did I change their heart and mind with my conversation? I don't know. But I do know that they have righted a wrong to those people that were discriminated against. And maybe they will start seeing that it is better to do business the right way. And so I think that sometimes is the advocate model. That's a small action with one supplier of our product, but it made a huge impact to those people that were not able to buy our products purely because they were an LGBT organization, which is completely wrong. And I think that's where you see the advocacy model really work, is you take a stand. And, you know, it doesn't matter what people say is their reason. You take a stand of no discrimination, and you pursue with that, and you continue with that. And I always love, whenever we do this, I always make people send apology letters. I think it's so important, just from a human rights standpoint. People like to be apologized to for being wronged, you know, and I think that's one of the things that, being a lawyer, I like to do often. I like to have people send other people apology letters, because I think that just really gets at the heart. And I think it's really hard for people to do that sometimes. And so I always feel like I get a win if someone sends someone an apology letter. So that's a small way of doing the advocacy model, but I think it really works, and it can work in small ways, and then use the same approach, it can work in a big way.
Yeah, absolutely. And this goes back to what you were saying, Claire, earlier about, you know, in terms of taking on the advocate model, first look within your own operations and your own organization, and secondly, to look at your supply chain. So in this case, P&G, with your purchasing power that you have over the supplier, to be able to get them to issue an apology and to reflect deeply on their values and actions, is definitely a very worthwhile a tactic to deploy, and more effective if you're P&G, or the larger the organization you are really. Awena, Alfred, do you want to chip in on that also? No? Oh, okay, Weena, go ahead.
I think I cannot top what Claire had mentioned in terms of that example, because that's really a great example of having a company apologize because of not catering to a specific minority in the environment. And I think the consumer industry as a whole has been one of the great examples on how they thread and touch the community as a whole. Because I mean, as consumers, you have very vast customers, similar to other industries, but consumers itself, these are essentials. It's not something that you could take forward or leave behind, because these are essential needs that you need on day to day. So for you not to cater a specific minority is just way off. I mean, it's just below the belt. So it's nice to hear what Claire had shared in terms of the businesses do apologize to their customers. And I do agree that along the line, you don't know if they're doing it because of keeping the business, or is it just more, okay, let's just do it, but I don't really understand advocacy. But behind it, I think what's important is they were able to bend down, given that P&G or any other industry is very firm on their advocacy. And hopefully along the line, especially for countries that do not have anti-discrimination policy in place, I hope that example serves as one true thing that eventually can happen, and someone can influence one after the other.
Yeah, I think as a resource for all the advocates internationally, we need to have Claire give public access to all her apology letter templates, so that we can use it to for all businesses that wrong the LGBTI community in some way or another. It's like, here we have a bunch of templates for them to pick to make good and get back in good standing with our wonderful corporate allies. So no, thank you for that, Claire. That's fantastic. So how do companies operating in Asia use an LGBTI growth cycle to assess risks? So this will be for any of you who might want to answer this. So when we're looking at a jurisdiction's legal, social, company environment, how do we build capacity? Not just in terms of cultivating internal champions or creating visibility at the grassroots and leadership levels, and partnering with civil society. What are some of the actions that can be taken to assess the risks of a jurisdiction's legal, social, and company environment? Would any one of you like to answer that?
I'll talk again. So I think for assessing risk, I think first and foremost, it's just the laws of the country. You can look at what they are and how they've been enforced. And I think that's important. And one thing that we have done with P&G is that when our employees come from persecution countries to countries that are not, we have an equality and inclusion event, and we ask them questions and we get information from them. So I think it's risk assessment is, you can look at it from a legal standpoint, but it's also talking with those local and understanding. I was talking with someone once, and they just told me, Claire, stop saying human rights. If you just call it diversity and inclusion, we can have a team. And so sometimes you just learn, that the risk wasn't really there. It's just the way in which you were framing it. So I think, and from a human rights standpoint, I will say it's about risk to people, and it's about impact to people, not risk to business. And, so we're trying to get our company and other companies to think about impact to people as the focus area and not risk to business is important, because if it was about risk to business, we wouldn't be doing anything because it's just too challenging.
Okay, well, thanks for that, Claire. We've got coming up to 7 minutes to the hour. I guess a very important question that I want to field to all three of you is what are the top two, if you had to come up with the top two advice considerations that you have for companies that are operating in Asia that want to take on an advocacy position on human rights for LGBTIQ people, what would be your top two advice considerations for these companies?
Well, for me, very clearly work together. So don't go at it alone, but work together with other players in the industry and with the civil society. As I said, you don't want to be the foreign company imposing your view of the world, but you want to work with other companies, but also a local civil society to do that. So work together and make it very specific, so tailor it to the country you're in, because not everything works the same way. So make sure you make it local. I think it's those two.
So number one, to work together as an alliance and a coalition. Number two, just be mindful about the local nuances as well.
Yes.
Okay. No, thank you, Ulfert. Claire, Weena?
I mean, Ulfert had great examples. I would say I completely agree with those two. I think seeking meaningful engagements with local LGBTI people and also local civil society organizations is critical. We can't do it without the advice of those being impacted. So I think those meaningful engagements, that's kind of that would be the one thing, is seek those out and listen to what they're saying to enable, to affect change.
So your two advice, Claire, seek out civil society, support them, listen to what their challenges are and support them on the ground. Weena?
Thank you. Certainly agree with the two of them. I think the only thing that I would wish to add is, first is understand the LGBT landscape locally. May it be the workforce or the talent that we have from an LGBT perspective, at the same time, their influence. So I think, and I say that because most of our talent market are millennials, and most of the millennials do identify within the community. So I think that's very important for companies and organizations to understand that. And now the battle between market competitiveness as to recruiting or hiring talents is really more on how inclusive you are or what compensation and benefits you offer the LGBT employees versus just the monetary value or the salaries that you provide. So that's one. And I think second of all is, I think we should come together as multinationals who have stronger understanding of DE&I and penetrate the local ones. I think Claire, going back to Claire's example earlier, that I think is the gap between multinationals and the local businesses. For us, we have a broader understanding of what inclusion is and how it impacts our business, our employees, and the communities we serve. But the local ones doesn't have that vast understanding, nor that advantage to even put in inclusive programs. So I think as multinationals, we have the ability and should be responsible in sharing that same values to the local organizations in the countries we operate.
Thank you for that, Weena. We've got 3 minutes left. I'm really encouraged by today's dialogue. We've covered various aspects of how the private sector can partner with civil society to act as a force for good. And suffice to say that all of us are in strong agreement that the when in Rome model is no longer acceptable. And even the embassy model is not adequate when there is urgency to advance LGBT rights for queer people everywhere. And the advocate model, which we've been discussing, is something that companies should ideally adopt. And it addresses one of the more elusive standards of conduct put forth by the UN, which is to actually act in the public sphere and not just within your own organization. It's also clear from today's discussion that while there is responsibility for all of us to advocate individually or as individual businesses, it is more strategic to advocate in unison to advance LGBT equality worldwide. And working together, we can actually have more impact and more result. We're coming up coming up to the hour, so I want to thank all of our panelists for their words and their wisdom. There are so many tips and tactics and strategies that all three of you have shared that I think are very relevant for people who are working on the ground in Asia, or people who are working in other parts of Asia that have oversight of the region. That's hugely valuable. And I also want to thank the audience members for taking time to join us today. There is a wealth of content that is being presented on Out Summit over the next 2 days or so. And I want to give a shout out to my fellow board member, Gigi Chow's keynote address. It's either happening today or tomorrow, depending on which time zone you're in. But it is a keynote, so I would urge everyone to make time to attend that. I'm sure Gigi will have lots of inspirational, wonderful things to say. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Claire, Weena, and Olfert for taking time. Claire, I know this is the second panel at Out Summit that you're on within the same day in your time zone. And Olfert, it's in the middle of the night for you. It's like 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the morning for you in Paris. And we wanted to make this session as accessible as possible to people who are in the Asia time zone, given that we are speaking with an Asia focus. So thank you, Claire and Olfert, for taking time to be a part of this despite the time zone challenges. And Weena, it's always great to have you on the panel as well. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we will call an end to this session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathy.